Okay, thank you. So I'm excited to tell you about the next 100 million years. I'm going to be talking about the young moving groups and associations with a focus on how we assess membership of stars in these associations, as it is a tricky question. And thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. All right, let me try and change slide. Okay, so as you may have understood by now, when stars form, they typically don't form alone. So you have a molecular cloud that is collapsing into itself into a large number of stars at once. And when this process happens, there is a little bit of scatter in the velocities of stars that happens because the stars interact with each other gravitationally. As you can see in this simulation here, the little white dots are stars being born. But on average, all of these stars initially move around the galaxy with a similar galactic orbit. So let me show you an example of what galactic orbits look like. So this is all of the stars around the sun projected along their best estimated galactic orbit. So you're going to see all of these stars being spread apart and converge with each other. That is just an effect of the shape of the galactic orbits. But if you pay close attention, you will see that there are little clumps in these distributions of stars, and they get a bit harder to see at the end, but I'm gonna go back to the start so that you can see them a bit more easily. And these clumps represent some non-open clusters like the Hyades or the Pleiades. And you can see that they are getting stretched out and in as they are rotating around the galaxy. And something else that happens, which is not shown in this animation, is that they will encounter some perturbations in the galactic potential that might be due to complexes of massive stars or other molecular clouds, and their orbits will get slowly disrupted over time. And because of that, the stars that were born initially on the same orbit are going to be scattered away on different orbits. And after a few rotations around the galaxy, each rotation takes something like 250 million years. So after a few times that amount, they are going to be mixed thoroughly with the other stars. So initially, we can recognize these groups of stars that form together, even if they are not gravitationally bound, just because they still retain this initial velocity in common with their molecular cloud. But after a couple hundreds of millions of years, their velocities get distributed randomly, and you cannot recognize them by just looking at their velocities anymore. So this is an actual empirical measurement of this that was done by Kunkel and Covey recently. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what their study used. But basically, you can see a large number of coeval groups of stars. So coeval means they have the same age. And this shows you the spread in velocity within each of these groups, as well as the spread in the z direction, which is the direction along the depth of the galactic plane. And you can see that as the ages get older, the spread in both velocities and the z position of stars go up and up and up with time. So a couple 100 million years would be located somewhere here between 8 and 9 in log units. And you can see that this is about where the spread in both z and velocities starts getting very large. And in practice, even though the stars still retain some loosely bound kinematics, the spread becomes too large for us to empirically distinguish them from any other random stars in the galaxy. So it becomes very hard to identify groups of stars that started co-moving without being gravitationally bound. If you wait, let's say, a billion years, it's going to be hard to distinguish the group of stars with respect to other random stars in the galaxy. So I want to show you a video based on a recent paper by Tariq et al. That shows the positions and velocities of a large number of known open clusters around the sun. So you can see that with their measured velocities from Gaia, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Gaia in the further slides. We can see for the first time a snapshot of how these open clusters are moving in the plane of the galaxy. And open clusters are gravitationally bound, and that makes them a lot more resistant to the perturbations I was talking about. So they can last for much longer before they get completely mixed with other stars. How long they can last depends on how dense they are, so how many stars they have. So the more stars they have, the more solid they will be, or the longer it will take for the galactic rotation to dissipate them completely and mix them thoroughly with the rest. So it's not uncommon to see open clusters with much older ages than the looser young associations. So here I'm showing you a map of some of the currently known young associations near the sun. So if you limit yourself to about 150 parsecs around the sun, we know about a dozen moving groups, and we are slowly discovering some more recently, especially with Gaia. But basically, this is a map of the position in the galactic plane of where these associations are located. So if you go further to the right, this is the direction in which the galaxy rotates. And if you go further down, this is towards the galactic center. So the zero here on that figure with the cross in the middle, that is the position of the sun. And one thing I want to bring your attention to is that some of the nearest ones, like the orange circle that indicates the Beta Pictoris moving group, or the blue circle that indicates the AB Doradus moving group, those are so close to us that the sun is actually physically located inside of the distribution of stars. So that doesn't mean the sun is part of these associations, but rather it means that the trajectories of the sun in these associations are currently crossing each other along the galactic orbit. So we are in the current moment located inside of some of these loose associations, even though we are going in slightly different directions. So there are some known associations with a wide range of ages around the sun. That is very convenient because it allows us to put an age dating to different stars that are at different processes through different steps through their evolution process. And so each of these associations acts as a snapshot, and with this snapshot, we have many stars of different masses, and we can study their properties as a whole. And we can even study the properties of exoplanets around them if we are lucky enough to find an exoplanet around one of these stars, which are members of these groups. And one thing that is very interesting about these groups is that imagine you have 200 stars that are part of the same group. So that means they are all moving together and they all formed very quickly with each other. This means we can combine a lot of different age dating methods to all of these stars. Some age dating methods only work with low mass stars, others only work with medium mass stars or high mass stars. And what we can do with these full populations of coeval stars is combining a lot of different methods to get much more precise and even more accurate age estimates. So we suffer less from biases that are specific to different age dating methods because we combine different methods with different biases. And the large number of stars allows us to also combine and reduce the error bars on our age measurement. So this is some of the most precise ages we can get for stars in the range of 10 to 1,000 million years, for example. And I also put the distance from the sun on this figure because this is a very relevant parameter, especially when we want to study the exoplanets around these stars. So basically, the closer a star is to us, the brighter it appears and the easier it is to study it. This is in particular true for the direct imaging of exoplanets, because an exoplanet with a fixed physical separation from its star is going to appear wider on the sky if you put it closer to you. So it makes it easier to resolve exoplanets around the star, but it also makes it easier to obtain a good signal. If your planet is very, very faint, you get a better, more brightness means a better signal for a fixed telescope size. So the nearby associations are extremely valuable to study brown dwarfs or exoplanets and the low mass stars, which are much fainter. So unfortunately, what we don't have are very nearby and very young associations. So you can see there's kind of an empty bubble of below 10 million years and about 60 parsecs. So there aren't extremely young associations of stars that are very close to the sun. So if we want to study stars that are only a few million years old, we have to go to slightly further distances. So I want to show you a view of the currently known open clusters and young associations within about 500 parsecs from the sun. So 500 parsecs is a bit generous because it becomes hard to study the direct imaging of exoplanets or brown dwarfs at 500 parsecs. This is starting to be quite far, but if you limit yourself to say 100, 200 parsecs, you can study them in pretty good details already. But if you go all the way to 500 parsecs, you can still study the low mass stars and the stellar population to better understand stellar astrophysics, which bear a very big impact on our understanding of exoplanet properties. So here, I want to come back to the concept of some young associations being so close to us that the sun is actually located inside of the spatial distribution of its stars. This is true of, for example, the AB Doradus moving group. And if I place each of the stars that are part of the AB Doradus moving group on the sky, this is a full map of the sky. And you can see that each red circle that represent each star in the group, they are spread pretty much everywhere on the sky. So if you just use the location of the star on the sky, you will never notice that there is a coeval association of stars here, because it would be completely lost in the signal of all the random stars on the sky. So it's really a needle in a big haystack. The way in which you might recognize that these stars are part of a group moving together is by tracing a great circle on this map and by using the proper motion of the stars. So if you take images a few years apart and with your telescope, you're going to see the star moving with respect to background stars. And what you are seeing is a two-dimensional projection of the 3D velocity of the star on the sky. So it's kind of the tangential component of the 3D velocity of the star. And if you turn on the velocities on the galactic on the map of the sky here, and you go millions of years in the future, what you would see is all the stars converging at a single point on the sky. And that's really the same effect as if you were in the middle of a flock of birds that are all moving together in 3D, and you are looking at the direction of each bird. You're going to see them at very different directions when you are in the center, and as they move away from you, they are going to appear to converge in the same direction. So this is really the same phenomenon here. You are seeing the stars converge on the sky because as they get further away, you are seeing the same components of their 3D velocity, and you are seeing the direction to which they are going. So if you have an association of stars, such as the Pleiades, for example, that is just a bit further away from us, the position of the stars on the map of the sky are going to be clumped together. So it's going to become much easier to distinguish the association from other random stars. It's really when these associations are close to us that they are hardest to identify, especially if they are loose, if they are spread apart spatially, and if they have a smaller number of stars in them. So the big difficulty in finding the members of such loose and nearby young associations is that we need to reconstruct their three-dimensional velocities to really check that they have the same velocity in 3D. And what we usually start with is just the knowledge of their tangential motion, which we call proper motion, and their position on the sky. So before the advent of the Gaia mission, for example, we didn't even have a distance measurement for most stars. But even now, after the advent of the Gaia mission, we still don't have the radial velocity component of most stars. And this is basically the velocity of a star towards us or away from us. So this is required to reconstruct the 3D velocity of stars and verify if a star is really a part of these loose associations. So our team created a tool that is called Banyan Sigma to make this search more efficient. So basically, instead of requiring parallax and radial velocity measurements for all stars on the sky, by the way, parallax is a way to measure the distance. Even without having this for all the stars, you can use Bayesian statistics to identify the stars which position and proper motion on the sky are consistent with one of the known Young associations. And then you can focus on those for the radial velocity and parallax measurements, which makes it easier to complete the populations of these Young associations. So what we did to achieve this is that we built a 6-dimensional multivariate Gaussian to fit the distribution of the members. So basically, this is a normal distribution in 6 dimensions. So you have 3 dimensions for the spatial position of the star, and you have 3 more dimensions for the 3D velocity of the star. So you build a model for all the known stars in a Young association, and then you take a new star you want to test and you try out all possible radial velocities, all possible distances, and that allows you to put a probability on how likely it is that the star is a member of a Young association. And we modeled the field distribution with a combination of 10 Gaussian distributions, because the distribution of velocity, especially of the field stars, is non-Gaussian. So by combining many Gaussians together, you can capture this shape. And here is a 3D visualization of the XYZ components of the nearby associations. So XYZ is basically the spatial location. So here you can see some nearby open clusters like Coma Bear and some more sparsely distributed Young associations. And so far we have only modeled a couple of the nearest associations. And one of the major reasons for this, I'm going to come back to it, but it's because it's very challenging to get complete lists of all members of Young associations with their good quality kinematics to build these models. So recently this is changing because of Gaia. So here I'm showing a video where we just start at the sun and move away from the sun. And this is actually based on data. So you can see the 3D positions of stars for the first time for so many stars. So you can see really how the stars are located in 3D around us. And this allows us to refine our models and be much more efficient in our search for new members of Young associations. So here I'm showing a single white pixel for the volume around the sun, for which we had good quality measurements of distances. That was before Gaia. So the best data set we had for this before Gaia was called Hipparcos. And it basically contained good distance measurements for this little white pixel on the map of the galaxy. And now with the second data release of Gaia, we have this large red circle for the same type of quality for the distance measurement. And it grew a little bit with the recent early data release 3 of Gaia. And we're going to get a couple more data releases where this red circle is going to get gradually larger. So as you can imagine, this completely revolutionized this field of research. One of the first things we were able to do with this is to immediately identify a very large number of low mass stars that belong to these Young associations, because for the first time we had distance measurements for much fainter stars. And this is giving us a large bank of stars with known ages, even for the cooler and lower mass stars. And this is a a depiction of the color magnitude diagram of all young stars within 100 parsec of the sun before and after the second data release of Gaia. So you can see that we are populating the low mass stars, which are on the right part of this diagram, much more efficiently with Gaia. And we also discovered some brand new associations of stars that we had not noticed before Gaia. So one example of this is the mu-tau association of stars. And if you want to have a complete description of how we found it and how we characterized it, I wrote a more popularized blog post about it, where you can read in a lot of details, even if you're not too familiar with this field. And another very exciting thing that happened is a study by Kunkel and Covey that identified 1,000 coeval and co-moving groups at distances up to 500 something parsecs from the sun. And so this revealed really the structure of the kinematics around the sun. And it's very interesting because, among other things, they found some very spatially extended structures that seem to be moving together in space. And this hints at something very exciting that was discovered right after. But first, I want to point to you that there is an empty bubble at the center of the results, which is about 80 parsecs in radius. And the reason for this is that they don't have radial velocities for most of the stars in Gaia, and thus they have done some machine learning clustering in 5 dimensions. So 3 dimensions for space and 2 dimensions for the projected velocities of the stars. And because of this geometric effect I was telling you about, where the very nearby stars have a wide range of positions and proper motions, those don't cluster well when they are nearby. So this is why they didn't recover some of the most nearby groups of stars. So here I'm showing you a 3D rendering of all the clumps of stars that they uncovered in Kunkel and Covey. Some of these don't appear to clump spatially, and that is because they are loose and they clump in velocities instead. So they have similar 3D velocities. Another super exciting discovery that was made was the discovery that the Hyades, as well as Coma Bear, had tidal tails around them. So those are very well studied open clusters, and simulations predicted that as they dissolve, as they get torn apart by the interactions with other structures along their orbit around the galaxy, some tidal tails are going to form. So those are more sparse groups of stars that are getting slowly ejected from the open cluster, but that retain similar velocities still for a while. And then another recent paper by Myrs et al. Found similar structures of tidal tails around 10 nearby open clusters. So we are really starting to get a picture here of how common these structures are. And we also, with our team, identified a very large structure around the core of the Ursa Major moving group that we think might consist of all the low mass stars that we are missing in this cluster, because it is much older. It is about 600 million years, and it has thus started to be dispersed significantly. And these stars extend to several hundred parsecs in radius, and their velocities are starting to be quite dispersed, but it seems that we are still able to uncover them in Gaia data. Another very exciting thing that we realized with Gaia data is that some of the young associations I was telling you about, which are very close to the sun, that are sparse but co-moving, we realized they might actually be part of some tidal tails around open clusters. Some of these examples include some less studied open clusters like Plate 8. It is not very far from the sun, about 150 parsecs away from us. And it has exactly the same velocities and the same age as 2 of the most well-studied nearby moving groups that are called Columba and Carina. And we realized that some of the structures uncovered by Kunkel and Covey kind of formed a bridge between these open clusters and the young moving groups we were studying for so long under different names. So here I'm showing you a map of a couple different groups uncovered by Kunkel and Covey, as well as Columba and Carina. and the Plate 8 open cluster. And all of these things that were studied under different names, we think they are all part of Plate 8 and its tidal tails potentially. And this is a very recent discovery. And we're gathering more data to confirm that this is actually the case. I want to show you, yes, we recently published an AppJ letter about this. And I want to show you a 3D rendering of this. So Plate 8 is the small bunch of stars in white here. And I'm going to show you the Carina and Columba nearby associations in blue, which share the same velocities and the same age. And after this, I'm going to turn on some of the coeval and co-moving structures identified by Kunkel and Covey, and how they form the missing parts of what looks like tidal tails around the Plate 8 cluster. And we have a similar case of this with the Plate 5 open cluster, which is even less well studied. It's basically mentioned in 2 papers in the literature, and it seems to correspond to the same structure as what we have studied under the name of octans and octans near. So this is a bunch of the octans and octans near stars, which are very close to the sun. And as we turn on other structures discovered by Kunkel and Covey, you can see that they seem to form a continuous distribution. And again, those all have the same ages and 3D velocities. So I have put a student on this project now, which is trying to identify new structures near the sun. So for this, we are modifying a machine learning metric so that it works without radial velocities. And this, we hope this will allow us to uncover these large spatially extended structures within 80 parsecs of the sun. And this is one of our first results, which seems to potentially confirm one of our hypotheses in the AppJ letter I just mentioned. So basically, we hypothesized that IC2602, the open cluster, and the Tucana horologium association might be yet another case of this, but we didn't have any structure in Kunkel and Covey that was able to bridge these two things because it happened too close to the sun. And with this modified machine learning clustering algorithm, we were able to uncover some stars bridging IC2602 and the Tucana horologium association. So we are putting all of this in a SQL database because one of the big problems we have in this field is that membership and characterization data for all these young stars are very scattered across the literature. So we're trying to put them all together. And so this database contains a lot of things, lithium equivalent width measurements, activity measurements, radial velocities, Gaia distances, and we are able even to combine radial velocities from many different catalogs so that we can be more robust against the effects of binary stars with changing radial velocities, for example. And here is one example of what you can do with a single SQL query using this database. Here I'm showing the lithium equivalent width distribution of stars with different temperatures that is traced with their Gaia colors. And you can see how stars of different ages form different sequences in this graph. And similarly, you can do this with UV colors with the Galactic mission. So we can really start to study these populations of stars at different snapshots of age and really do some population analysis with this database, which we're going to publish very soon. And one of the things we're also working on is updating the Banyan Sigma tool with much more detailed models. For example, here, with a combination of multivariate Gaussian models that can model the tidal tails as well as the non-Gaussian core at the center. You can capture a non-Gaussian core with a combination of several Gaussians like we were doing for the field. So I'm gonna end here and I don't know if I have time left for questions, if the counter was including questions or not.
Yeah, when the yellow starts is the question bit. So we're running just a few minutes behind, but let me just, there's a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A. So please, Jonathan, thank you very much for a great sort of setting context for our neighborhood. And please go and during the break, maybe you could answer a few of those. They're going to be cleared, so if you can do that right
Yeah.
afterwards. But let me just ask one of them, which I
Right.
think you sort of just touched on. But one person asked, when you were determining the members of a moving group, how certain can you be of whether or not a star is in that group? How much dispersion can there be? And are there other indicators for membership? And you just started talking quickly about a couple, but maybe just to stress that.
Right. So we have a couple different ways to be more robust against contamination. Some of these are stellar activity measurements, but we can't do them for all stars. So some of the UV and lithium figures I showed are useful for this. We can also use the color magnitude diagram of stars, and not for all stars. There are some types of stars for which it doesn't distinguish very well from the old stars. But basically, we can use a combination of different observables to make sure the stars we are studying are indeed young. Typically, this will only tell us they are younger than 100 or 200 million years, but this already reduces by a large amount the amount of contamination. And then we rely on the fact that these young groups, especially the younger ones, have a very tight distribution in UVW space, typically 1 kilometer per second or less. Whereas the field stars, they have a spread of, let's say, 20, 35 kilometers per second for the moderately aged stars. So even though you have a lot of random stars around us, you can greatly reduce the amount of contamination if you have the full 6-dimensional measurement of this position and velocity of a star. And typically we combine this with at least one measurement that tells us the star seems young. And by combining all of these together, we can get our rates of contamination to very low numbers, but there's always the trade back of recovery rate versus contamination rate. So if you want to be sure you recover all the members of a group, you have to be a bit more generous in your threshold, and you're gonna have to let in a bit more contamination.
That's a great point. Okay, so